In today's lecture, we are going to discuss the theory of consumers' behavior. That is chapter number 2. We are going to deal about consumers' behavior, the theory of consumers' behavior. So in the previous chapter we have already discussed the nature of central economic problems. So we have explained and discussed the various nature of the central economic problem. So we are going forward in discussing about the consumer's behavior. So in the first topic we have, that is utility approach to consumer's behavior. So here we are going to discuss about the consumer's behavior from the perspective of utility. So from the utility side, we have to discuss consumers' behavior. So when we talk about consumers' behavior, we have to discuss what is demand or demand for goods. So a consumer has a demand. The duty of the consumer is to demand goods and services. So what is the economic definition for demand or demand for goods? So when we our normal discussion or our normal definition of demand is completely different from the economic perspective. So from economics point of view, what is a demand? So demand for goods would mean a consumer must have the desire to have that good, and desire is not enough. He has to have the willingness to pay for the goods, and not willingness to pay is not enough, so he also has to have the capacity to pay. So desire for the goods, willingness to pay for the goods, and lastly the consumer must have the capacity to pay for the goods. Only then these three conditions are satisfied, then it is called demand. And you know what a consumer will do? A consumer will demand more of good, or a consumer will demand a particular good when he derives greater utility from that good. So demand will increase when a consumer is deriving greater utility from that particular good. So demand for goods and services plays a very important role in determining the price of the goods. So demand is a determinant of price. And when he derives a greater utility from that particular good, he is ready or he is prepared to pay a higher prices. But when he is not deriving the enough utility from the good, he will not be prepared to pay at a higher price. He will be willing to pay the lower prices. So when we talk about here greater utility, you need to know the meaning of utility. So utility means amount of satisfaction from consumption of goods. So the amount of satisfaction that a consumer derive in consuming various goods and services is called utility. And we can say that utility is a subjective concept. It is a subjective concept, and it may differ from person to person, from people to people. So for example, a person who is fond of having coffee will derive more utility from drinking that coffee than a person who does not like a coffee. So suppose you like a coffee and your friend doesn't like a coffee. So subjective concept would mean, since you are liking that coffee, you are deriving more utility from that coffee, whereas your friend who doesn't like coffee, he derives less utility from that coffee. So utility is a subjective concept. It can differ. It is different from person to person, from people to people. So we need to somehow measure this utility. So for measuring utility, modern famous economists like Marshall suggested that utility can also be measured like the temperature, the humidity and all those things. So it can be, cardinally measured. So utility is measured through a cardinal units that is called units. So, okay, I'm so sorry. Measuring utility. So in order to measure utility, we are using one cardinal unit that is called utils. It is not utils. It is not, it is not units, but it is utils. So cardinal unit called utils is used to measure utility. So when we talk about utils, it is an abstract thing. It is an imaginary psychological unit that we use for measuring the utility. So utils, once again, it is an imaginary psychological unit used to measure utility, and we use cardinal units utils to measure utility. So when we are talking about measuring of utility, so the correct measure or the best way to measure this utility is we measure in terms of money. Measuring in terms of money will be more correct when we talk about measuring of utility. So how much amount of money or how much amount of rupee you are ready to spend for that good is equal to the amount of utility that you derive. Suppose you are ready to spend 5 rupees for a cup of tea. So the cup of tea or the 5 rupees is the utility that you derive from that cup of tea. So in terms of money, when we measure utility, it is more correct. I'm repeating the example again. Suppose you are ready to pay 5 rupees for a cup of tea, then the utility you derive from that cup of tea is equal to 5 rupees. And consumer demand for that goods or services depends upon two things. That is, utilities that he derives in consumption of that good and the level of income that he gets. So consumer will demand goods based on his utility derives from that good and his income, given level of income. So since a consumer depends on utilities he derives from the goods and his level of income, we have to see, or a consumer has to see, at what point is the equilibrium point. So consumer's equilibrium point. So when we talk about consumer's equilibrium, we have to keep in mind that a consumer is rational. Rational in the sense that, a consumer spends his income or money on goods and services, on buying goods and services that will maximize his, satisfaction. So a consumer is rational, meaning that he will spend or he will buy those goods and services that will maximize his satisfaction. So consumer's equilibrium would mean a consumer spending his income in a way that maximizes his utility. So that is the point. A consumer is in equilibrium, spending his income so that he will maximize his utility. So when we talk about equilibrium position, it means that, the consumer has no tendency to reallocate his expenditure among goods that he is buying. He has no tendency of, changing his, changing the goods or reallocate the goods that he is buying, because he is already satisfying his utility to the maximum level when it comes to a consumer's equilibrium point. So when we talk about this equilibrium position, we have to discuss what is total utility and marginal utility in detail. Okay, when it comes to total utility and marginal utility, let us see the differences according to the looking at the definition. So the definition for total utility, it is the sum of, totaling up of satisfaction or utilities that a consumer derives, from all units of a goods or combination of goods consumed by a consumer. So it is summing up of all the utilities or satisfaction deriving from all the units of good that is being consumed when combined together. when he's consuming, or when combined together all the goods and services, the total satisfaction that he derives is the total utility. For example, the satisfaction which a consumer gets by consuming a cup of tea is, let us say, 15 units. Let us say by consuming a cup of tea he gets 15 utils. Again, he gets 12 utils from consuming bread. So when we talk about total utility, we have to combine the satisfaction or utilities that he derived in consuming both tea and bread. So we add them up, we sum them up. That is 15 from consumption of tea, 12 from consumption of bread. So total utility is 27 utils. That is total utility. But when we talk of marginal utility, when we talk about marginal, it is always extra or additional to the total. So it is the extra satisfaction or utility a consumer derives, from consuming an additional unit of commodity when amount of other goods consumed is held constant. So suppose you are, consuming tea and bread at the same time. So let us say you are, keeping the bread consumption constant and you are taking additional cup of tea. So the additional amount of utility that you derive when you are consuming additional cup of tea, that is the marginal utility. It is the extra satisfaction or utility that you derive from consuming an additional unit of commodity. Here, cup of tea and bread. So you are, keeping the bread constant, because it says that when amount of other goods consumed is held constant. So it is constant here, bread. But you are consuming additional cup of tea. So you are deriving additional amount of utility. That is called marginal utility. So it is the addition, made to the total utility. So it can be expressed as marginal utility MUN equals total utility N minus total utility N minus 1. So it is expressed in this form, where N is any given number of units of a commodity consumed. N is the any given number of unit that a commodity, amount of units of commodity that is consumed. So marginal utility is the difference between total utility. So total utility difference, and that obtained from consuming 1 unit less of it. Suppose you are, consuming an additional amount of, goods here, and you are, consuming less amount of another unit. So the difference between these two is the marginal utility. This is the total utility of any commodity that is consumed, and here it is the total utility that you derive while consuming less of the other good. So marginal utility is all about the difference between these two entities. That is total utility derived from the consumption of the goods minus the total utility that you derive when you are consuming less of it. So you will come to know this, equation when we explain in a tabular form. So in terms of calculus, it is given marginal utility is given by change in total utility divided by change in quantity, where delta Q is 1 and total DTU, change in total utility is, so the DTU is total utility. So here it is given in calculus form. Okay, look at this table and you will understand what is, total utility and marginal utility all about. So look at when a consumer takes 2 cups of tea per day, his total utility increase from 12 to 22 utils. So this means that consumption of the second cup of tea has made addition to the total utility by 12. That is 20 minus 12 is 10. So in consumption of 2 cups of tea, the consumer has increased, or in other words, consumption of the second cup of tea has made an addition to the total utility by how much? 10 utils. So 10 is the marginal utility of consuming 2 cup of tea. And again, if the consumer increases his consumption of tea per day to 2 to 3 cups, his total utility increase from 22 to 30, which means the consumer has made an increase in the total utility by consuming 1 more cup of tea. That is from 2 to 3 he has increased. So here he has made an additional unit of 8 utils here. 30 minus 22 is 8 utils. So by consumption of 3 cup of tea, a consumer has increased his or he has made an addition to the total utility, an amount equal to 8 utils. 8 utils is added to the total utility of 22, and that 8 utils is the marginal utility. And again, it will be seen from the table that beyond this 6 cups of tea per day, his total utility declines. So his total utility declines, and therefore marginal utility becomes even negative beyond this 6 cup of tea. So his total utility declines, or it stops. Say 42, and it keeps on declining after 6 cup of tea. And so when this total utility declines, marginal utility also declines, and it may even go down to negative. And we will use this table or the same concept when we discuss about the diminishing marginal utility or the law of diminishing marginal utility. So we have seen that the marginal utility or the utility that you derive when you are consuming an additional amount of cup of tea, your marginal utility keep on decreasing, or your total utility increase at a decreasing rate. So it is increasing but at a decreasing rate. 12, 10, 8, 6. Your total utility increases from 12, 22, 30, 36 but at a decreasing rate. That is why it is called the law of diminishing marginal utility. So when we talk about total utility and marginal utility, total utility is the amount of utility that you get, or when you sum up all the utility that you derive in consumption of these goods. But marginal utility is the additional amount of utility that you derive in consuming an additional amount of goods, keeping in mind that the other goods are held constant. That is all about total utility and marginal utility. So in order to not make you confused, let me explain again the concept using this table. So when you are consuming 1 cup of tea per day, your total utility is 12 utils, and here even your marginal utility is 12. But when you are consuming 2 cups of tea, you are getting a total utility of 22, which means that your total utility has increased. So how much has your total utility increased from the previous consumption is the marginal utility. So it is the difference. Okay, 22 minus 12 is 10. So 10 is your marginal utility. Your previous total utility was 12 only, and while adding 1 more unit of good or cup of tea, you are getting your total utility 22. So marginal utility is the additional amount of unit. Marginal utility is the additional amount of utility that you get in consuming additional unit of cup of tea.